the United Kingdom right now, and the passing of Her Majesty the Queen. I was fortunate enough to know her. And I always used to say that there were only a handful of people that I met while I was in office or afterwards that are exactly the way you want them to be. The Dalai Lama, Nelson Mandela, Queen of England,
Barack Obama.
When you think about 70 years of maintaining that kind of grace and intelligence through these remarkable changes, not just in her own country, but around the world. And her being a symbol that helps hold that nation together, recover from war, reconstitute itself. And yet, when I met her, my main impression was she looked just like my grandma. and sort of had the same attitude. She was no nonsense, didn't have a lot of patience for fools, but was always proper and correct. But she had this dry sense of humor. So, and behind the scenes would just make these gestures. When Michelle and the girls and my mother-in-law came through London, probably in my second year in office, and there was no expectation that they were going to be seeing her. Actually, Buckingham Palace reached out. She decided to invite them over for tea. And so I've got Malia, who at that point is 11, Sasha, who's 8, and my mother-in-law, who was a stay-at-home mom and a secretary for a bank who lived on the south side of Chicago all her life, sitting there with the Queen of England. And then she insists that the girls take her golden carriage, which I guess she uses for jubilees and things, out on a drive through the palace grounds. And none of this was ever reported. It was just something that she did quietly. But the gift thing was always a challenge, because when you have these meetings with foreign heads of state, you exchange gifts. Being out-gifted is always like embarrassing. But you're also trying to, at least I was thinking, well, let's make sure they can actually use the gift. So, apparently, Her Majesty loved Broadway shows.
Yeah.
And the iPod had just come out. And so our office thought, we'll get an iPod, load it up with Broadway show tunes. Well, the British tabloids thought this was entirely inappropriate. But I secretly think that she used it quite a bit. Who knows? She might have at some point downloaded very quickly.
Very for them.
Touch it there.
Yeah, maybe for the stage. Okay, we were just talking about this, but the first time I heard you speak was in 2004 here in Boston at the Democratic National Convention. And you had that magical line, there's no conservative America, there's no liberal America, there's the United States of America. There's no red states, there's no blue states, there's the United States of America. And you went on and on, it was fabulous. What do you feel about the United States days? Better or worse?
No, look, I think obviously we're more divided than we were even then. It's interesting. People remember that speech, and that was probably the most famous riff in the speech. But the title of the speech was "The Audacity of Hope." The key signature line for me in that was the idea that hope is not blind, willful optimism. It's not. It's not sticking your head in the sand. It is slaves sitting around a fire singing freedom songs. It's people fighting and struggling and overcoming great odds in order to make the world a little bit better. So that passage about being a United States of America was aspirational. It wasn't a description of the world as it is necessarily. It was a description of the world as we'd like it to be, but we have to fight for it and we have to work for it. What I did maintain then, and I believe is still true now, is that we have more in common than our public discourse would allow for. I meant what I said at the time when I said, in blue states we got Little League and eat apple pie, and red states, they love their gay kid, or they, are in church, helping on a food drive for the poor. But what has happened is that our national conversation has broken apart. And a lot of that has to do with technology. I think the explosion of social media, we talked about the iPod, that was new now, right? It's hard for us to realize that the phone that is in everybody's pockets is 10 years old. I mean, and now you go to the most remote corner of the planet, and that's one thing everybody will have. And so the splintering of a single narrative into a million narratives, and the degree to which, rather than having a single shared story, even if it was often flawed, we now have multiple stories. All that, I think, accelerated the sense that we are occupying different realities. And it turns out that the economics behind social media, but also behind a lot of cable news, is let's accentuate conflict, let's accentuate difference, let's make people angry, let's make them resentful. If we make them mad, it turns out they click more or they watch more. And so that, I think, has helped to break us apart. And then politicians who are not courageous enough to push back against the anger and resentment, they go along with it or accelerate it, as we've seen.
What can all of us do as citizens to make it more united? What advice do you have for us here more?
Well, look, the United States is a big, multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. And democracy is hard and contentious. So I don't think what our goal should be is kumbaya, we all agree on everything all the time. What should bind us together, and as citizens, I think we all have to work towards in our own lives and in our communities and workplaces that we have. What democracy really stands for is we are respectful of a certain set of rules and processes whereby we sort through those differences. We recognize, that we are imperfect and we have blind spots and we do not know everything. Hence, we are willing to sit and talk and listen with other people and get their points of view. And we have a bunch of rules. Right now, everybody's sitting and listening, and even if you think I'm an idiot right now, you're not going to jump up and just yell, unlike a member of Congress who once did that to me while I was there. Because you're abiding by a certain set of conventions and rules, and that's what the First Amendment's about. Somebody says something that infuriates us, but our rule is, okay, I can also answer back with better speech. That's why we have certain rules about elections. And then, if it doesn't go your way, even if you're not happy, you say, okay, I accept the results, because there's something that is more important than I think that we all have a role to play in understanding that maintaining those norms, habits, rules of citizenship. That democracy is delicate in the sense that delicate's the wrong word. Democracy is not self-executing. Like, we have to continually agree and re-up for maintaining these kinds of norms and rules. And by the way, this comes out of a set of rules, or this way of thinking about self-governance is connected to the way we think about knowledge generally, right? Essentially, this explosion of technology that has transformed our lives all comes about from a scientific process, which are essentially a set of rules where we say, you know what? For us to know something is true, we have to observe it. We have to be able to repeat experiments. We have hypotheses. There are differences between facts and opinions. We test it. If we're wrong and it doesn't withstand criticism, then we start over with a new set of hypotheses. That too, how we know what's true in the world, how we agree on what is true in the world, and how just operating on logic and reason, all those things, they're useful, and we should affirm them as opposed to reject them. I don't want to run too long of a rant here.
You're on a roll.
I'm on a roll. Let me make one last point about this, because I think it is important for those of us who like to think of ourselves as on the right side of some of these debates to recognize that we too have not always lived up to some of these rules. Right? So I don't want to get into a long debate about wokeness and this and that and the other, but what is true is that, and I talked to my daughters, one who's still in college, one who was a recent graduate, where there is a certain level in which with very good intentions, young people and not so young people want to shut down. And if somebody says something not quite the right way, or says something that could conceivably be interpreted as offensive, the notion is, I do not have to listen to you, as opposed to, let me listen to you and then answer. And I do think that that is a mistake. You can't wake people up if you just put them down. And so that, to me, violates the rule that, which I guess is an article of faith for me and my politics, which is that at some level we are all connected. We have a common humanity. You are understandable to me, and if I'm listening, I can find a place in which we see each other, and that we may be able to change each other's minds, or at least agree to live together without beating each other.
Yeah, great words. we have a lot of founders. Raise your hand if you're a founder. A lot of founders. If you think back of the founders of the United States when they were in startup mode back in the 1770s, and they're building their products, what's the best feature they built into that startup, and what's the worst bug they put in that startup?
Well, the best feature
Yeah.
is essentially the architecture I just described, right? Which was them figuring out, and there was no way for them to know that this would work. It was a little bit, it was a pretty radical idea, right? We're going to set this thing up where people get a chance to vote. They have their representatives. We're going to break up into different branches of government. We'll have an addendum, but it's important that we'll have this Bill of Rights. People can speak their mind. They follow certain rules and procedures, and so we will be able to perfect the union, or at least make it more perfect through this process of debate and marketplace of ideas, and we'll be able to sort through our differences peacefully and transfer power peacefully, and sustain this despite our regional differences, etc. So I agree with Winston Churchill that the U.S. Constitution is the best expression of ideals dating back to Magna Carta and the idea of individual dignity and rights and so forth. They got that right in a lot of ways. The worst feature is pretty obvious, which was didn't apply to those black people who were enslaved, and it didn't apply to women who constantly occupied the people. Didn't even apply to white guys without property. And so what you see then is a series of struggles, some of them bloody, all of them fierce, to broaden the definition of we the people, who constitutes a member of that body politic. And as more amendments and civil war and the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement and union struggles and so forth, and most recently the LGBTQ plus movement. And so all those things make the union more perfect. But unfortunately, if you think about it as code, even with some of those glitches fixed, we still have some others that pop up. And I think that one of the challenges is that it's hard to update that Constitution. The constitutional amendment process in the United States is really challenging, which means that the Supreme Court then has enormous power to interpret the meaning of these words. And if you get a court that thinks the way to interpret those words is to look at the intentions of the people who wrote them, then that means that you are inherently freezing in social norms and ideas from 200-something years ago. And that's, I would suggest, maybe not the best way to think about it.
So those founding fathers, it's 246 years in. It's not a startup, it's a scale-up. How are they thinking about it? Are they surprised it still exists? Are they delighted with their invention and how it's evolved? Where's their head at?
Well, I mean, look, I think you've got to assume the colonies were a pretty ragtag operation, right? So for look and it turns out this became the mightiest nation on earth, but it kind of held together. I'm assuming they'd be pleased by that. I think it's fair to say if they looked out at this audience, they'd be a little shocked. Both at the demographics and also how casual everybody is. There was no, the athletic wear trend. Nobody was wearing hoodies back then. $500 sneakers. I see you guys. But I think that and listen, I do not want to duplicate the error that I think some make of trying to pretend like you can get into the heads of long dead people and assume what they would think. One thing that I almost certainly they could not have anticipated would be, let's say, how our U.S. Senate works. And the fact that Wyoming, with a population of about 500,000, gets 2 senators, and so does California with 33. That's not something that they anticipated, and so part of the challenge we have in our democracy right now, and it's on display almost every day, because I think, first of all, can I just say I had a photo line with some of HubSpot's. HubSpot's. Yeah, I do that sometimes. 61 people. But you guys looked really young to me. It was disturbing. But that happens to me now. Pilots, doctors. How old are you? You're in charge? But many of you have not seen a functioning Senate in a really long time, and a barely functioning Congress most of your adult lives. They used to work all the time. They used to pass bills. Seriously, and Democrats and Republicans would, work on stuff. But part of what some of this is structural. What you have is because Wyoming has 2 seats and California has 2 seats. What was already a slight anti-majoritarian feature of the Constitution. The Senate is designed to be somewhat anti-majoritarian. We don't have direct democracy. We have representative democracy. The fact that we have a Bill of Rights so that the majority can't just overwhelm a minority point of view, all that has been amplified so that in the U.S. Senate at least, a 35% of the population may have 50% of the representation, which is part of the reason why it's very hard then to get things done. And that's an example of how, thinking about can we create a system that still protects minority viewpoints, minority rights, regional interests, but at a certain point, if the majority of the American people think it's not a good thing that we can buy AK-47s and shoot up a school, so we should do something about it, that we could actually get that bill passed and signed it.
Let's look out 2050. does the world look like? What does the global order look like? What's America's role? Are we ascending? Are we descending? What's the world look like?
Well, it will be hot. For one thing. And I say that not as a pessimist or a doomsayer. I am actually cautiously optimistic that we have it within our power to arrest and eventually stop the pace of global warming. But those of you who have studied it know that just like a car that's racing towards a cliff, you have to hit the brakes. The car is going to keep on going for a while. And so we know with the amount of greenhouse gases that are emitted and the trend lines that we're seeing and some of the negative loops that have been set up, it's gonna be at least probably 2 degrees centigrade warmer. And that is significant, and it will have dire consequences. And there will be enormous economic costs, human costs, and disruptions. On the other hand, I do not consider that an excuse for inaction or to crawl up in a fetal position, because I was talking to Aaliyah about this. Your generation, younger people, I think, are much more conscious of this, and she said sometimes she feels like, all right, what am I going to do? How should I just leave everything and just only work on this? And even if you did, how would you do it? And I said, look, everybody's got a role to play. But even if we're not going to solve it immediately or perfectly, the difference between 2 degrees Celsius warmer and 3 degrees Celsius warmer, that could be 100 million people displaced or killed. That could be the difference between a manageable set of adaptations and unmitigated disaster. That's worth working towards, right? And so I think that's one thing that's going to happen in 2050. Beyond that, I think we are at a moment, both here in the United States and around the world, in which we are going to have to, we're a little bit at a fork on the road, where either we figure out how to live together in our multiplicity and diversity and difference, and find ways to cooperate, or we're going to duplicate what happened in the 20th century and we're going to see more conflict. And I think that can go either way. And I think at the heart of that battle is, or at least connected to that battle, is a big debate between an old style of power and government, which is top-down, hierarchical, might makes right. Somebody's dominant, somebody's subordinate. And it's a zero-sum game. Or a inclusive, rights-based, more cooperative form of government. And that battle between authoritarianism and democracy is duplicating itself around the world. And when you get these big technological and demographic changes, a lot of times that's tempting to people who say, I want to keep things as they are. Change is scary. And so I'll go for the guy who says to me at least that he's going to stop change. And that contest is one that we're in the middle of right now.
Yeah. Let's shift gears on you. You were referred to as no drama Obama when you were in office. I thought that was clever. And I do remember that moment when that person in Congress during your address to Congress barked out at you. And you really kept your calm. That was impressive. The world's going through, and all our companies are going through, crisis after crisis after crisis of managing, whether it be COVID or the economy or the social issues going on. You seem to thrive in those crises. What's your secret? How do you stay calm? How do you think about a crisis? How do you make decisions in those situations? Give us some tips.
Yeah. It helps being born in Hawaii. Because, you know, it's always 80 and sunny. It's like, you just grow up kind of chill. Look, some of it is temperamental. You know, within our family, we have what we call the long faces and the round faces. Michelle and Sasha have round faces. Malia and I have long faces. And you know, it's like carnivores and vegetarians. The long faces are just kind of, you know, cold steak on my head. It's all good. Round faces are fierce. But I say that just because, you know, some of it's temporary. But I think the thing that is applicable across the board, and this is true for leaders in business, in the military, in any circumstance. I think it is very useful to maintain a long view. And particularly in crisis, there may be things you have to do right away. We have to put out that fire right now. There is a hole in the boat. Right? We need to get vaccinated. What an amazing thing. You know, let's make sure we use medicine to solve a public health crisis. So there's an urgency to just dealing with what's in front of them. But emotionally, what I tend to be pretty good at is understanding that things are never as good as they think they are, and they're never as bad as they are at any given moment. And so, for example, it's one of the reasons why I rarely, if ever, watch cable news or got my news off social media, because that is specifically designed to elicit an emotion immediately that may have nothing to do with long-term trend, but has everything to do with getting, you know, going to the reptilian side of your brain and getting it wired up. So related to that, I think, is if you're taking the long view, then part of what you want to recognize is most big decisions, certainly in crisis, but even when you're not in crisis, involve probabilities. If a crisis has happened, that means that, or if you're confronted with a big challenge, it means that there's no perfect 100% answer. And I used to describe one of the things about being president is, by definition, if somebody could solve it easily, then it would not reach my desk. Somebody, I don't know, 4 layers down would have solved it. So, you know, it's one of the few circumstances in which, you know, there's that expression, something rolls downhill. In the White House, it rolls up. It's like, oh, that stinks. We'll let him figure it out. So what that meant was, you're always dealing with probabilities. Should I say in the auto industry? Now there's 40%, 50%, 51% chance that we'll get the outcome we hope for. 30% chance it won't work, 10% chance it actually makes things worse. Should we go after that compound in Pakistan where we think Bin Laden's there? You know, the CIA and the intelligence community would come to me with these complicated numbers and analyses to try to make it seem as if they actually knew. We think it's a 62% chance that this happened. That doesn't sound good. But what you did figure out was if you set up a good process for decision making, then you can make what ultimately will be a judgment call with the best information possible, and you can do so with confidence. And then it doesn't mean the decision you make is going to be right every time, but it does mean that you can have confidence that nobody could have made the decision better than I did. And what that involves, I'm not saying anything that people here don't know, it does mean that that's one of the reasons why you want a diverse set of viewpoints around the table. And that's the reason why you want to be respected. That's the reason why the way you measure information is not based solely on station or where it's coming from, but what's the quality of the data, or the coherence of the analysis. I've spoken about this before. I used to, in the situation where we have people sitting around the table, all the big cheeses, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Secretary of State, Defense. Then on the outer table would be folks your age with these like notebooks, take all these papers, and if I had big decisions, a lot of times I'd go like you. I don't know your name. What do you think? And initially they'd be shocked because their assumption was they would speak in these meetings, except I knew they were the ones who were preparing the memo that the big kahunas were reading. But they didn't know it as well as the folks back there did. So figuring out systems, and some of it is just representation. We know that if you have a critical mass of women on boards or in groups, the group will make better decisions. But it's not just representation, then you also have to build a culture so that people feel free to talk. And that's something I had to learn. That's an example of a blind spot. We have these amazing senior women in the White House. First year, though, I noticed that a lot of the senior women wouldn't speak in meetings because the guys did the guy thing, right? Which was, a woman made a point, they repeated 15 minutes later, so it was theirs. Our group of the senior women came finally and said, well, some of us are ready to quit. And so we had to have a conversation, and I had to realize that even though I would call on women and I'd ask their opinions, etc., I didn't check sometimes the men, or at least talk to them intentionally about, look, you guys may not be trying to do this, but this is the environment you're creating, and we got to do better. And so all that does two things. One, it made me confident that I was making good decisions, even if they were hard. And even when sometimes the decision turned out not to have the outcome I wanted, I was at peace saying, we were thorough, we were prepared. The second thing is it gave everybody ownership of the decision, so that when a decision went wrong, there wasn't a bunch of sniping of who was right and who was wrong. Everybody had their say, we made a decision, we executed. Now we learn from it, we go back, we're going to go through the process all over again, and that's part of how you build a culture
talk a little bit about your foundation and what you're thinking for your post-presidency and how that's going to shape up?
When Michelle and I were about to leave the White House, we said, all right, what's our next chapter? We were pretty young. And there were all kinds of causes I cared deeply about. Climate change, civil rights, racial justice, economic justice, reducing inequality. But what I learned from the presidency was that most of the big issues that we confront, the problem is not that we don't have good technical solutions, maybe not perfect, but at least good technical solutions. On climate change, we have to still invent some stuff, but with technology we have right now, if we apply it, immediately we produce the trajectory of greenhouse gases. What prevents us from solving problems usually is the human element. People getting along and cooperating and being informed and caring about others. And so we thought, you know what, let's really focus on how do we systematically train and develop leadership at every level around the country and around the world. And that's really what the foundation's been focused on. We have thousands of remarkable young leaders, some in government, some in the private sector, some in nonprofits, working on climate change, healthcare. You got maybe it's a doctor in South Africa that's setting up portable clinics for women's health, or it might be a young woman in Vietnam who's actually created sort of a civilian conservation corps to plant trees or reforest areas that have been torn down, or it's somebody in Oakland who's working on reintegrating ex-offenders. They meet, we work with them, we train them. We have cohorts in Europe, Africa, Latin America, here in the United States. And so we're building this network of, we want 100,000, million, a few million young people who are doing extraordinary work already feel as if they're not alone in that work. They are part of a broader community to bring much.
That's fantastic. Thank you for a couple things. Thank you for your service to the country. Thank you for bringing a class act to the White House. Thank you for coming in, Matt. You've been fantastic. Join me in thanking you.